All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. The topic is going to be strategic decision making, enabling your contingent workforce model. I am Laura Moritz. I'm going to be moderating. I am the Vice President of Product Development and Implementation for Flentis. I'm joined by Brandon, who is newly our VP of Sales and Strategic Partnerships, and Mickey, who is the founder of CWM Strategies. Thank you both for joining me today. All right, so today's discussion, we're talking about contingent workforce models, which one's right for you, why that one's right for you, how are you going to make that selection. Really quickly, do want to tell the audience that we will have a Q&A at the end of the session today. So you can drop your questions in the comments throughout this webinar, and we'll pick them up at the end and answer them. Before we dive into everything, Brandon, if you want to just give your quick intro of yourself, and then we'll go to Mickey and get started.
Well, thanks, Laura. So yeah, my name is Brandon Evap. I am the VP of Sales and Partnerships here at Flentis, having an MSP and a staffing supply side background before this, and really looking forward to getting into the discussion today.
Hey everyone, I'm Mickey Pelletier, founder of CWM Strategies. I'm an independent consultant focused on helping clients figure out their strategy for their contingent workforce programs, also partnering with providers of contingent workforce services to help them right size their offering for clients. I've spent the past 17, almost 18 years in contingent workforce on the MSP side, VMS side, consulting side, and as a client side program owner as well. So really excited to be here, and thanks Flentis for having me. This is cool.
Of course. Thank you both. So I'm super excited to have the conversation today. I think it's a hot topic in the industry, especially for those Gen 1 programs that are kind of making their way into the contingent workforce space and really building out their programs. So kind of just to set the stage for the discussion today, I want to talk about what the different models are and kind of get some light, loose definitions around those before we get started. So Mickey, if you kind of want to just walk through what models you're familiar with, or I know there's kind of some different acknowledgement or different terminology used in the industry. So if you want to kind of just give your brief definitions.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we're all pretty familiar with the MSP model, the managed service provider that comes in. Sometimes that's called an outsourced model. You're having another company come in to manage your contingent workforce program for you. There's also the in-house self-managed program, which is made up of people of the actual enterprise or company. They run the operations, manage the day-to-day themselves. Then there's a hybrid, which could be a combination of both. Maybe you have your MSP running a particular piece of your business. Another piece of business is run by your in-house team, or perhaps by a separate MSP. That can certainly happen with companies that are across multiple geographies, having an MSP in one place, a different MSP in another, and maybe even an in-house team in another. So those are sort of the three traditional ones that most people are aware of.
Perfect. Brandon, anything to add from that perspective?
Yeah, I think two things that I'd probably add there. One, just kind of adding a caveat to the MSP space in general. There's a couple like models within the model, if you will. So if it's a vendor neutral model is one of the more popular ones now. It's been growing for a while. Then there's also master vendor and vendor on premises as well. So really just depending on what your situation is, one of those models might work better than another. The other thing I would add is, with somebody like Mickey, for example, really been gaining steam with independent consultants and helping to kind of build that process or guide that process, even come in post go live. Like if you've just centralized a program, bring in a consultant maybe a year down the road to do evaluation and kind of guide you as to where you're going next. That maybe you could kind of define as a hybrid type model. But I think that's been a very growing model in particular, is using independent consultants like Nikki.
I think that's
Yeah.
cool that you. Sorry, Laura. I'll interject. Yeah, I think that's cool. I'm glad you called that out because I just recently rolled off a project with a partner of mine where we rolled out a VMS, and then we helped the program office, which was internally managed. We helped stand them up, get them trained, help them figure out their roles, responsibilities, what they need to do to be able to run and sustain their program. So I certainly think that is a great call out of other models that exist. They kind of tie into the traditional models that we know, but in terms of their setup and how they come to life, it could be a little bit different by having an external consultant come in. And certainly all for that service offering.
Yeah, I think that is something that we've seen gain popularity, whether it be because the organization thinks that they can manage the program, they just need help with some implementation and streamlining processes and things like that. Kind of one of the questions that I've heard a lot is when we're talking about in-house programs, how can a consultant kind of come in and help throughout that process? What value add are they bringing to the table? And Mickey, I think you're probably the perfect person to answer that question.
Yeah, thanks. I think the ability to come in and help them figure out what they don't know. They don't know what they don't know. We all know that saying, right? And likely the folks that they have may have some sort of background, either with an MSP or a VMS or staffing. So they likely have the industry knowledge, but perhaps not. I've worked with folks that have come from an HR or a procurement background, but weren't necessarily coming from a contingent workforce background. So I think a lot of it is really the education, what goes into running a successful program and understanding what a company needs to stand up a program successfully and what success is and means for them. Obviously, there's a huge element of change if you're going from no program to having a program, or if you're implementing a VMS, or you're swapping technologies, what have you. There's elements of change that need to be factored in, and a consultant can kind of shed some light on the things they need to be thinking about as well. So those are sort of the common ones where myself and other awesome consultants come in to help out and figure out. It's a lot of just all of the things I've seen in the industry from the angle of the MSP, the VMS, the consulting, having run programs. There's just so much to think through. And oftentimes, if you are trying to implement or manage a program yourself, you can't see the forest for the trees, right? Because there's so many, maybe I got that saying backwards, but there's so much going on that you can't always think of everything that needs to be taken care of and what you need to administer, what you need to be on top of, what you need to project manage. So having that additional set of eyes and hands certainly can just make sure that less things fall through the cracks, and that you're thinking holistically about the entire project and how that project turns into the actual program and everything that goes into it. It seems like it could be fairly straightforward, but there's just so many nuances that you have to be on top of to ensure success.
And I think one of the things that's really interesting is it kind of depends what the current state of that program is that helps determine what their future looks like. Maybe a Gen 1 program is different than, like you mentioned, someone who's just changing out technologies or changing out an MSP or expanding their program. So can you kind of talk through a little bit, maybe Brandon, what are some factors to consider when you're any of those organizations in any of those positions? What should they be considering when they're looking at these different models?
Ooh, where to start? There's so much that goes into that question, right? And I think that's where we
I'm
get
glad she went with you first.
Okay. Yeah, and it really depends on each organization too, and I think it really starts with figuring out what your goals are for the program. Because if you don't understand where you want to go, there's no way you're going to get there. And a lot of that comes down to having a strategic understanding of what the business needs and how contingent workers or SOW, whatever else, how does that fit into your overall talent acquisition strategy? Is it something that is short term or is it long term strategy? And that's where really it's a very important to get stakeholder buy-in and be having conversations with people that know the answers to those questions, especially at the C level, very early on in that process. So I think that's really where I would start is understanding what are the business goals, what are the ROI, and where do we see ourselves going, and then from there, how do we get to that point? And that's where your solution is going to come into play. That's kind of the high level. I kind of took the cheap route there for you, Mickey. I'll let you do the hard part.
Yeah, no, because there's a lot of different ways to come about it. I mean, I think you have to know where you've been to know where you're going. What's been the culture of the company? How have things been done up to this point for managing contingent workforce? Because I think that goes into factoring the change that you have to administer and being able to accommodate the new processes, programs, technology into what already exists, and making sure that that change is digestible by the end user. But I think, yeah, always starting with what's the problem you're trying to solve. You know, there's always the basic of, oh, we want visibility, maybe we want cost savings, we want a better supply chain model, things like that. And each organization is going to have their own dynamic goals. There's no one size fits all, despite what everybody tells you. There's a lot of things we're all trying to do. Everybody wants visibility, but perhaps that isn't the biggest. I always get a little concerned when this thing pops up at the bottom. Maybe it's saying, don't listen to this guy, he doesn't know what he's talking about. But they the goal that you're trying to achieve, and what I think it's important to know that you're not going to go to this generation 4, whatever you want to call it, top tier mature program right off the bat, that there's little iterative things that you do along the way. It's a long journey, and just being able to acknowledge that you have a problem. That sounds funny, but just being able to acknowledge that we need to have some sort of governance, some sort of model, some technology to manage this contingent workforce is really that first step. And then saying, okay, how do we control that and get to what we need to do? And like I said, knowing that you're not going to take off in a rocket to these, you're not going to bring in, direct sourcing freelance models right off the bat. You're probably just trying to figure out, hey, what are we doing with our staff aug workers, and what's even going on with statement of work. So I think that's just one thing to keep in mind, because you have a lot of companies that want to go all in right off the bat, and that enthusiasm and that ambition is admirable, but you have to take things one step at a time, and in being able to move at a pace that your end users can follow along with, and it's actually meeting their needs and tackling where the real problems, I hate to say the term, pain points are, right? That's sort of PM 101 or implementation 101 of being able to get this in the door, is going after those big rocks in a meaningful way.
And I think that's really important to talk about the basics too, because I think a lot of times folks may not know where to begin or what their goals are. And they think contingent workforce program, like if you're going to ask me what do I want, where do I want to go? Like, I don't know. And so what are some other goals that you can kind of think of other than just kind of getting staff aug sorted and the visibility? What are some goals that a contingent workforce program could potentially have? And Mickey, I'll give that one to you first.
Yeah, the usual consulting answer. Well, it depends. Obviously requires some thorough analysis to understand where it is you want to go. Like I said, because sometimes it is just getting a technology to centralize and get visibility. But as you progress and your program becomes a little bit more sophisticated, there are things you want to tackle. Perhaps it is statement of work. We want to get better visibility into that. Maybe it is we want a direct sourcing channel because we are using repeatable talent. We have good branded marketing and recruitment around people want to work for us, even if they're not our direct employees. Then there's just the little nuances. We don't have a good rate card. We're just paying all over the place. If you don't have a good supply chain strategy and you have 300 suppliers and you need to get that down to maybe 30, there's elements there. If you just have managers doing whatever they want willy-nilly, you need to get that under control. So there's a lot of different goals. Perhaps it's compliance, maybe it's IC compliance. All of that really comes together to the reasons why people do this, and then their goals sort of shift depending on where they are and what they want to do. But I think all of it's very attainable. It's just a matter of sorting out and prioritizing what do you need right now, what's step 2, what's step 3, and just being mindful of that as you proceed through. So I don't know if I directly answered your questions. There's a lot of different goals that companies could seek to bring in.
No, I think that's perfect. And really just the goal of that question was just to give the audience some examples to get them to start thinking about what might be a good fit for them or what they may be looking for with their program. Brandon, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think two of the ones that come up the most often in conversation with prospects or clients is one, cost save. That's always on procurement's mind at the very least. But then you kind of dive into cost save, and it's, well, how are you trying to achieve that? And in a lot of cases, people don't know. And to Mickey's point, they don't know what they don't know. So maybe they've heard, hey, with a VMS and an MSP, I can get cost save. But how do you achieve that? Is it through, having better expertise in different labor markets and being able to make those decisions strategically for hiring a resource, maybe onshore versus offshore, or in a specific market in the US even? Or is it something about supplier optimization, implementing rate cards, like Mickey said earlier? What actually is your cost saving measure? There's a lot that kind of goes into that. The other one that I think comes up very often is just more or better access to talent. And it's tough when we're talking to organizations that are like, I keep having these same roles come up, and the time to fill is taking me 4 weeks, and really that's hurting our ability to meet deadlines on projects. If you can cut that in half through better access to talent through different suppliers, or maybe it's through a direct sourcing channel or whatever else it may be, then that can be really impactful. But again, that may be the broad goal, is better access to talent, but then you also have to decide, well, what's right for the business in that case, and which avenue do we go down? And if you don't know those answers, then you might need some outside expertise to kind of help you get there.
So, and if I'm an organization who doesn't know that answer, which of the management models or the models that we've talked about so far would be the best one to reach out to first or to engage with?
I don't know that you want to start engaging with any of them until you kind of know what it is going to be a good fit for you. I'll obviously always advertise having an outside consultant to come in to give you that opinion and maybe peace of mind in terms of that selection process. Because if you're going out to an MSP, obviously an MSP is going to want to say, no, we can service this best for you. You don't want to go in-house. And they should say that, right? They're trying to sell their services. And many MSPs out there are very knowledgeable, very smart. That's what they built their expertise around, is being able to provide that service. But I always recommend a neutral model, because perhaps if you have in-house people, you may be able to run it yourself right off the bat. Perhaps it's easier to go and bring in an MSP until you get a good handle on everything, and then you could bring it in-house. I don't ever want to say that there's a right or a wrong answer. I am a big fan of in-house programs, only because the market, the contingent workforce market, and the talent that knows this space has grown exponentially over the past 10, 15 years. And there's a lot of smart people out there that can run these programs for you, that have the expertise in the space. And so I think that's a more viable option than it ever was. And a lot of them grew up in the MSPs and the VMS, and they've lived their lives doing that. Now they're shifting their ways of thinking that maybe we don't need to outsource. Maybe we could bring this internal and do it that way. So I don't know, another consultant answer, it depends, but I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer. And it requires some thoughtful analysis about what's appropriate. And I think your level of commitment, if you're going to build an in-house program, you better make sure that you have the appropriate people to run all parts of the operation, and that you have somebody to really check that. Where if you go to an MSP, they can run a lot of it for you, and perhaps you just need someone to oversee that. I'm not saying that's the end all be all right answer, but depending on that level of commitment, because if you're going to run it in-house, it requires more resources, more funding, and perhaps just a different management mindset than you would of just outsourcing and allowing someone else to take action with you providing oversight and strategic direction.
Yeah, and I think I'll add on to that as well. Best place to start is going to be internal. Really evaluate what resources you have on hand. What do the people within your organization know? How can they really help? And this kind of goes back to getting stakeholder buy-in, because if go through that process and you go through all of your internal resources and understand what everybody's role and contribution can be, then when you make that decision to leverage an independent consultant or start evaluating MSP, all those people are already on board because they've already all seen, hey, we don't have the answers for this internally, so we have to go outside. We have to find that answer somewhere. So that's where I think I would start. But again, to Mickey's point, the actual model that you end up with, is really going to vary organization to organization, which I always hate saying, but it's just that's how it is. Unfortunately, I wish we had a silver bullet.
Yeah, I mean, do your research. There's companies out there right now that are talking to everybody and their mother about what they should do because they want to get that opinion or that viewpoint of what would be appropriate. And you could ask around till you're blue in the face. Eventually, you do need to make a decision, right? And so being able to have the right information in front of you, but also equipped to say, you know what, this is where we're going, and this is what we're going to do, and land on that and move forward.
I think that's a really interesting point because I think a lot of people get kind of paralyzed by that decision making and they don't want to move forward. Can you kind of speak to the flexibility of this? It's not something that is implemented and set in stone for the rest of your company's existence. How can you kind of make those changes as the program evolves?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you make a decision, you probably need a minimum of a 2-year commitment to what you're going to do, particularly if you go to an MSP, because they're going to require some level of contract to say, hey, we're going to be your provider for at least 3 years, and then we'll renegotiate, we'll reevaluate. And the element of change of going from one provider to going in-house or going to another provider can be a substantial lift. I'm not saying it's the most difficult thing to do, but I've been a part of a few of those changes. And going from one provider to a next can be somewhat painful depending on the amount of end users there. So I think, yeah, there is flexibility, but know that you are making some level of commitment, for X amount of years at a time. But this isn't set in stone forever, and it's actually encouraged to pivot and change and do things differently. Because perhaps a new provider is going to bring in a new perspective that is a little bit different and maybe even challenges your own way of thinking and completely dismantles what your previous provider or way of working had done things. And I think that's one thing that can be lacking is everybody talks about being innovative and doing the next not cool thing, but the next awesome thing for talent. But are you really doing that? And I think that's when you get into this continuous way of thinking of letting the same MSP guide you and not change the ways. I think we could become a little bit complacent or stagnant in our way of doing business, which just, and perhaps your way of working is going great and stagnation, complacency is okay because you've already reached a top tier. But show me how many companies have reached that level and that they just created this sustainable thing where they can coast, because we all know that the way of talent, particularly in the contingent workforce world, is ever evolving, and new, sometimes recycled ideas resurface that maybe weren't that great 10 years ago, but with the right technology in place, we could bring some really cool things to life now. And I think we're starting to see that with, the reinvention of direct sourcing and freelance talent platforms that are challenging the more traditional ways we've engaged talent in the past. That's a whole other webinar, but those are just things that I see of, to go back to your original question, carve a path of where you want to be, know that you can pivot at some point, but you are making these 2 to 4 year commitments at a time of maybe where you want to be, so that you're not overloading your own organization with too much change.
Yeah, and I think the key word there at the end is really change. I think it's no secret that we as people are just very resistant and scared of change, and that's no different in the business world. So anything that you can do to help mitigate that fear or resistance to change is going to be very beneficial. And as an example, I think Mickey, you had mentioned in a previous question about maybe segmenting things. So like if an MSP has one particular business group or something along those lines, that's a very common practice in change management, is having stages for change. Breaking things down that seems like a big, complex, long process, breaking it into smaller stages will probably make the appetite for change a bit easier, or better to implement and sell internally. So that's one thing I just wanted to add real quick.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about what you could commit to. You can have anything you want, but you can't have everything you want. So you got to find out what's appropriate now for you, to make that change feasible and reasonable within your own organization.
One thing that I think was really interesting that you said, Mickey, was sometimes if you bring in that outside consultant or an MSP, getting an outside perspective can be beneficial, even if you do have some expertise in-house. Can you speak to just a little bit of what that looks like and why it might be productive to have someone from the outside just have eyes on it and talking through the process with you?
Yeah, I mean, I compare it to sometimes like something's wrong with my car. It's rattling. It's making a noise. I'm fairly knowledgeable on cars and car parts, but sometimes it's best to go get that second opinion, somebody else that maybe works a little bit more intimately with cars day to day, to be able to figure that out, and even equate that to your own health care. Because you could go on Google and look up anything you want about your body and your health, and maybe get a good idea, maybe find some answers that scare you. And granted, with health, you should always go to a doctor, but I digress into that analogy simply because getting an outside opinion enables outside. Let me find the right words. Additional ways of thinking of things. Being able to get out of our own head. We're very maybe caught up in our own thought of how things are done, and being able to have some outside person consult and give you additional advice can help shift your way of thinking. It could take your own thoughts that you have right now and help you expand upon those to ways of, I don't know, like I said, just expanding the thought to a new way of thinking that really elevates how things can be done, and just give a perspective that may challenge your own thought. I mean, to me, it's just really important to get a little bit of an outside point of view, because your own way of thinking may not always be right. And I'd even say that about consultants. Everything that a consultant says isn't necessarily right, but it's good to know and validate that, oh, hey, you know what? What I'm thinking is valid, or it is the right way to go, or this person has actually seen it work elsewhere. So we're not as crazy as we thought, and we can go down this path. I'll always advocate for having that outside opinion.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned healthcare, so I just thought, don't WebMD your problems for contingent workforce, right? You can go down a slippery slope there very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, you can go on to ChatGPT and get some decent but highly generalized answers that aren't going to be specific for your program. It does require some industry expertise, somebody that's lived and breathed this for a while, and perhaps they'll tell you things that you disagree with. But it's always good to be mindful of that and factor that into your own way of thinking, as there may be more than one way of doing things, and neither is right or wrong. It's just a different viewpoint.
And I think, just like you said, Mickey, with it being important to hear an outside perspective, even for consultants or an MSP, there has to be kind of that give and take between that outside resource and the client themselves. So, Brandon, maybe you can speak a little bit about just what that relationship has to look like, even if you are not in-house, that required lift from within that client organization?
Yeah, it really needs to be a true partnership between the MSP and the client, or the consultant and the client. And I think we've seen several times in the past where that's not the case, and it's really just a standardized kind of process that somebody will follow. And I don't see those programs as successful very often. But really, when it comes to the relationship, you want someone that is able to understand what your business goals are and really work with you to meet those business goals. If they don't have a level of understanding on that, then it's going to be very difficult to actually give you best recommendations going forward. So that's very important. Um, I think also when it comes to MSPs, you're looking for someone that can maybe give you advice in terms of your path forward. Because I think for Gen 1 buyers, especially, if you're just starting that process, you don't really know where the road is going to take you over the years. So having someone like an MSP that can work with you and tell you, hey, we're going to, again, go in that staged approach where we're starting off with maybe we're starting off just with staff augmentation, and then we look in SOW or direct sourcing or whatever it may be. But they're going to give you a long-term purview of what goals are achievable and how you can get there. So I think that answered the question.
Yeah, I'll call out sharing Steve's comment on there. I think that's interesting, being able to bring that expertise from the outside, particularly as an MSP. And most folks at MSPs are pretty knowledgeable. Be cautious of who's giving you the advice. Salespeople may tell you one thing, it can get you to go a path, and that's not just MSP salespeople. Any salespeople will do that. So be careful who you're getting your advice from. But I think that's a great call out by Steve, simply because they do have the experience working in multiple sectors, various clients, and can be able to lend some pretty decent expertise around what they've seen and what may be applicable within your own organization.
Yeah, I think. Oh, Brandon, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was going to say, kind of even going away from the MSP side of things for a moment, just being able to reach out to cohorts in the industry as well is highly beneficial, because they're going to be able to confirm things for you or give you different insights as well. I think going to the conferences that we all frequent, CWS coming up in a couple months as an example, those are just highly beneficial for anybody to attend, because you not only have access to MSP and other solution providers, but you also have like-minded buyers that are facing the same exact challenges that you have. They may have discovered the answers themselves that are unique to their organization, but it's always valuable to have that discussion with someone like that.
Yeah, I think that's a super important piece of it, is if a client is going to run it in-house, or even if they do choose a consultant or an MSP, how can they make sure that they, as the client, are plugged into the industry? And I think there are a lot of resources, and conferences are definitely a good one. I think that's very important to be able to kind of stay up to date with trends and just know, especially if you are in-house, because an MSP ideally is attending those conferences and really plugged into the industry. So if you're in-house, I think it's very important to make sure that you're plugged into the industry as a whole.
I think that's so important, because within contingent workforce, we're a very niche industry, and we can become very isolated, particularly with contingent workforce programs being made up of one, maybe two resources you're isolated. Yeah, you have your HR, procurement, legal friends, but they're not talking the contingent workforce speak. So being able to network with your peers across other companies is so important. And there are some really good talent communities out there that connect with. There's a great comment from Dustin. Reach out to him if you need a community for program leaders, because it's connecting these groups of maybe isolated individuals that can, I don't want to say commiserate, but they can get together and talk about the issues and the things that they're seeing in a very real way, because these people get it. They know what the other's talking about. They've gone through mutual and shared experiences that are very meaningful, and I think validating as well, because when we talk to our families about contingent workforce, they nod and give the thumbs up and tell you you're a good recruiter. Meanwhile, you're just trying to say, no, there's real issues. We had non-compliance. We had people doing whatever the hell they wanted because they just needed talent now. And everyone nods their head. But when you talk to another contingent workforce program owner or someone even just in the industry, it can be very cathartic and validating to know that, man, that is a bummer. And we deal with real issues that are very relative to us that not many folks in the rest of the world understand. So I think, Laura, that's a good piece to keep in mind in our lonely little world of contingent workforce management, that there's other folks going through that, and it's good to stay connected for validation, but then also just learning what people are doing. And I'll stick this in my back pocket for later because perhaps we could apply that to our own program without even needing to be sold to by an MSP or VMS or even the loan consultant.
And Mickey, it's funny because that video, I don't know if you posted it this morning, but I saw it this morning that you posted on LinkedIn. I feel like it's speaking to just that, is it's such a specific industry, really, and such a specific knowledge base. And throughout this whole conversation, we've heard a lot of, well, it depends on so many different things. There's so many different use cases, scenarios, and getting that industry experience and just those relationships, there's always someone who has been through it before. As many scenarios as there are not very many that are just brand new and no one has dealt with before. So I think that is really important.
Yeah.
All right. So Mickey, question for you. I would ask Brandon, but I think we know what his answer would be. But how strongly do you advocate for a VMS within any of these models that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think the VMS serves a very important purpose in the contingent workforce life cycle. It's perfect for staff aug. I think it's still grasping and working towards being a catch-all for statement of work. Statement of work services procurement, because there's a lot of different tools that do different aspects of that. So I think you have to do your research and tread carefully around that, but it's definitely trending in the right direction. So I think the VMS is, I want to say, a must-have. Can you do contingent workforce without a VMS? Maybe, probably, but it's going to be pretty difficult. The only other avenue to explore out that is if you are having direct sourcing only, right? And all your talent is that way, but that's likely not the case. So you do need some level of VMS in there, and exploring other talent platforms through your freelance management. Unless all your workers are freelancers, that's not going to be the end all be all. What I really advocate and I think is being talked about is really that one-stop shop of technology that is integrating all of those various channels and creating a one-stop omni-channel experience where all of your contingent, via staffing agencies, via services procurement agencies, via direct sourcing, via freelance platforms, are integrated into one to create a holistic experience. And I'm talking a very advanced strategy. I could have just said, yes, VMS. You likely need a VMS to start out there, but there's a lot of different avenues of where that can go and where they're at in terms of meeting the consumer's needs right now.
Brandon, anything to add?
I never advocate for VMS. Me? No. No, but really, one thing I'd probably add here, just because some conversations recently at like ProcureCon, for example, is it's very much okay to not know if you need a VMS. And it's very much okay if you don't know what the difference between a VMS is compared to one of the other 20,000 talent platforms that you use or that are out there. I've had a couple of those conversations recently where it's like, well, what does this do compared to my HRIS? Or what does this do to this specific job board talent platform that I'm using? Right. And it's very okay to have that conversation because I think we've seen in our space very recently a lot of innovation. And as a result, there's so many different solutions out there that, I can't blame anybody for not knowing what the differences are. Sometimes I even will talk to Laura about new product functionality we have. I'm like, I didn't know we could do that in VMS, but that's how it happens sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, you could leverage your HRIS for this, and several companies have attempted to that, but there's a little bit of risk involved there, and it can just generally get confusing around what you're trying to do. So since it is a very unique and specific process, it typically does require a different technology, that being a VMS.
Yeah, and I think we've got this question on the screen. It's super relevant to what we're talking about right now, but how important is that VMS and the process structure, data capture, goal measurement, and I mean, in order to have a program and have the data and the metrics available to you, you almost have to have a VMS unless you're running some kind of elaborate spreadsheet and doing analytics off of that. But any thoughts on that, guys?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think it's absolutely necessary to centralize some of those functions of data capture, data management, visibility, process, goal measurement, all of that. And I think that's what they, with the latest builds and functions are coming out are intended to do, and be able to provide those functions. So it's absolutely important, and most of the reason why they exist. I guess is a short answer. I can't ramble as much as I usually do, because that one's pretty straightforward in my opinion.
Yep, it is. All right, switching gears a little bit, back to kind of decision making when you're talking about the different models of your program. What are some of the potential risks and challenges that a new contingent workforce program, or even not a new one, may face? And I know there are many, many, many of those, but if you guys can just give an example.
Well, yeah, and let me just make sure. I want to make sure I understood the question. Like, what are like sort of the risks of each side if you go in-house versus outsourcing to your MSP?
Sure. Yeah.
I don't know. To me, there's that risk of control if you allow your MSP to do it. There is some control that you don't have. Yeah, you control what the outcomes are that you want, but you don't necessarily control how those are met. You're not controlling that, we don't like this talent acquisition specialist that you brought in. We just don't like them. We can't oust them because they're not our employee. You may have some sort of say, and you can give that feedback. Where if you're managing a program yourself, you very much have a say on the more of the day-to-day operations and the folks that are managing and running those operations. So that's just one of the first things that comes to mind. Brandon, sorry, you were starting to speak there.
Yeah, but I'll kind of add on to the control thing. I think that's the biggest hurdle for people when they look at utilizing an MSP, is they feel like they may be losing some control. But really, if you have a strong partnership, I don't think that would be the case at all. I think, again, in an ideal situation, that MSP partner is really just an extension of your HR team. They are perfectly aligned with your strategy, and they're going to help you achieve those goals. I mean, I just saw on LinkedIn earlier today, it was a healthcare MSP, where the goal of the client was to completely erase all of their contingent spend. I don't know how realistic that is, but they've made significant steps towards that, even though that kind of goes against how the MSP makes money and functions. They've helped them achieve that. They've saved them over $10 million in contingent spend in the last year. So when you have that kind of alignment, I don't really see control as a real problem. I think it's more of a perceived problem. I don't know if you agree with that, Mickey.
No, and I guess maybe interpreting the question a couple different ways, which I think it's fine. Yeah, control doesn't necessarily have to be a risk. I think it depends on how you set things up contractually, how you set things up from an operational, how they adhere and accommodate to your culture and way of working within your business. And maybe that's not so much a risk, but just a consideration in terms of how you want your operations and program to go. So I think that's a fair point that you have, counter to my own. Yeah.
All right.
I guess I could give another risk as well, just to give a second one. Um, let's say let's do the inverse then with an internal model. I think the risk, as Mickey kind of stated earlier, is that you don't know what you don't know. So there's a lot of different areas that can affect. I think the most common that I see is generally supplier management in general. I mean, I've seen programs that have, you know, maybe 10 million in spend that have 200 suppliers technically onboarded, where each individual manager is going with a specific vendor that they use, and that increases their rates, along with a ton of other issues. But that's really the big risk there, is just you don't know what you don't know, and that can impact so many different levers throughout the process.
Absolutely. All right. Before we get to the last question, just want to remind everyone to leave any questions that you have in the comments, and we'll go through those during the Q&A right after this. Last question for both of you. We do this at the end of all of our webinars, but just one piece of advice or takeaway that you would give someone that is looking to implement or make a choice between different program models. And Brandon, we will start with you.
Well, I think my piece of advice is just to consult with Mickey and use Flentis, and should be good to go. But no, realistically, I think, as I've said a few times throughout the webinar, is just understanding where you are currently and where you want to go. Take the time to really map that out and talk to the people within your organization, across C-suite, across HR, talent acquisition, accounts payable, all these different functions, to make sure you have alignment. Because if you don't have that alignment, it just makes things so much more difficult to actually make a decision. And then once that decision is made, to actually get use out of what you selected in the first place. So that's my grain of salt for the day.
Yeah, I think that's good. Ties into the answer I was thinking of, is just being able to have analysis, being analyze what is your current state and what do you want to do, being able to bring about an idea of the path you want to go, and then being able to do research of how do you get there, get outside opinion, whether that is from your MSP, your VMS, or a third party neutral consultant. Get that outside opinion about what is feasible and what's possible and what's going to be best aligned for you based on the existing analysis that you have and research from the market. I think that's the best place to start, is arm yourself with knowledge.
Perfect. All right, let's get into the Q&A. We'll put some questions up on the screen. I will read them, and then Brandon or Mickey, whoever wants to answer it. Can you share examples of how companies have successfully transitioned from one CW model to another? What were the key challenges to overcome?
You want this one, Mickey?
Yeah. I mean, I've seen companies shift from MSP model to internal. I think the biggest, not the biggest, there's several things to consider. Is really how the operations were done previously, and are you going to be able to do better than what was done there? And if you're removing and going in-house, there's obviously a reason you think you can do it better, or there's some sort of consolidation. So I think being able to minimize the change and the impact, if they're used to working with Brandon talent acquisition specialist, they need to be introduced to their new acquisition specialist that's going to be working with them day to day, be able to build that level of comfort. Because when you're going to transition, I think that's one of the things that isn't always factored in, is those managers that are working day to day with the MSP. They built relationships and they've maybe built a rapport with them and a level of comfort. Now they're going to need to go to another team and work with some other people. So I think that's just top of mind answer that came to me of things that you maybe want to consider is that change.
All right. So, question here from Steve. I don't know that he's asking this question, but there's a question in here that I think it is worth answering. He's saying, if I'm a potential executive sponsor for a client and my TA or SC team is promoting a managed solution, my first or second question is going to be, how are you going to measure the success of such a program?
I love that question. That's such a good question because I think it's so relevant to the actual outcome, right? That we're looking for. And again, if you don't know how you're going to define success, where are we going? If your goal is to get cost save, is success a 10% reduction in markup, or is it something else? Is it a total figure that you're looking at instead of just the markup percentage? Um, I think even when it comes to utilization, I remember there was an RFP I responded to a long time ago for direct sourcing, and the goal that program had was very lofty for direct sourcing utilization. It was somewhere around 60% by year two. So 60% of their contingent workforce would be funneled through direct sourcing. And at the time, I did not think that was a realistic goal. I don't have any insight into whether they achieved that or not, but that's just an example. If you set a goal that is just unrealistic and unobtainable, then you're setting yourself up for failure anyway. So I love that question. Thanks a lot for that, Steve.
It's funny. I always answer it with a question. Well, how are you defining success? What are you moving towards? And then you'd be able to architect it backwards from there. And consultant and me answering a question with a question, but success is relative. There's sort of your canned things that every company wants to achieve, cost savings, visibility, et cetera. But I think individually from enterprise to enterprise, there may be more bespoke goals that really define that criteria to build towards success. So.
All right. Perfect. If there were any questions that we did not get to, we'll certainly reach out to you all individually and get those answered. Please feel free to reach out to myself, Brandon, or Mickey if you have any questions, thoughts, or just want to have conversation around the topic or any other topic. Appreciate everyone joining today, and we will talk to you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.